The Homeric question concerns the doubts and consequent debate over the identity of Homer, the authorship of the Iliad and Odyssey, and the historicity. The subject has its roots in classical antiquity and the scholarship of the Hellenistic period, but has flourished among Homeric scholars of the 19th and 20th centuries. The main subtopics of the Homeric question are: who is Homer? Of the Iliad and the Odyssey of multiple or single authorship. By whom, when, where, and under what circumstances were the poems composed? To these questions the possibilities of modern textual criticism and archaeological answers have added a few more. How reliable is the tradition embodied in the Homeric poems? How old are the oldest elements in Homeric poetry which can be dated with certainty? Homer is the manifestation of an oral tradition. Following the seminal work of Milman Parry, most classicists agree that, whether or not there was ever such a composer as Homer, the poems attributed to him are to some degree dependent on oral tradition, a generations-old technique that was the collective inheritance of many singer-poets. An analysis of the structure and vocabulary of the Iliad and Odyssey shows that the poems contain many regular and repeated phrases. Indeed, even entire verses are repeated. Could the Iliad and Odyssey have been products of oral formulaic composition, composed on the spot by the poet using a collection of memorized traditional verses and phases? Milman Parry and Albert Lord have pointed out that such elaborate oral tradition, foreign to today's literate cultures, is typical of epic poetry in an exclusively oral culture. A crucial words here are oral and traditional. Parry starts with the former. The repetitive chunks of language, he says, were inherited by the singer-poet from his predecessors, and were useful to him in composition. Parry calls these chunks of repetitive language formulas. Many scholars agree that the Iliad and Odyssey underwent a process of standardization and refinement out of older material, beginning in the 8th century BC. This process, often referred to as the million little pieces design, seems to acknowledge the spirit of oral tradition. As Albert Lord notes in his magnum opus, the singer of tales, poets within an oral tradition, as was Homer, tend to create and modify their tales as they perform them. Although this suggests that Homer may simply have borrowed from other bards, he almost certainly made the piece his own when he performed it. The 1960 publication of Lord's book, which focused on the problems and questions that arise in conjunction with applying oral formulaic theory to problematic texts such as the Iliad, the Odyssey and even Beowulf, influenced nearly all subsequent work on Homer and oral formulaic composition. In response to his landmark effort, Geoffrey Kirk published a book entitled The Songs of Homer, in which he questions Lord's extension of the oral formulaic nature of Serbian literature to Homeric epic. He holds that Homeric poems differ from those traditions in their metrical strictness, a formula system, and creativity. Kirk argued that Homeric poems were recited under a system that gave the reciter much more freedom to choose words and passages to achieve the same end than the Serbian poet, who was merely reproductive. Shortly afterwards, Eric A. Havelock's book prefaced a play to revolutionize how scholars looked at Homeric epic by arguing not only that it was the product of an oral tradition, but that the oral formulas contained therein served as a way for ancient Greeks to preserve cultural knowledge across many different generations. In his 1966 work Have We Homer's Iliad?, Adam Parry theorized the existence of the most fully developed oral poet up to his time, a person who could creatively and intellectually form nuanced characters in the context of the accepted traditional story. In fact, Parry altogether discounted the Serbian tradition to an unfortunate extent, choosing to elevate the Greek model of oral tradition above all others. Lord reacted to Kirk and Parry's respective contentions with Homer as oral poets published in 1968, which reaffirmed his belief in the relevance of Serbian epic poetry and its similarities to Homer, and downplayed the intellectual and literary role of the reciters of Homeric epic, in further support of the theory that Homer is really the name of a series of oral formulas, or equivalent to the bard as applied to Shakespeare. The Greek name Homers is etymologically noteworthy. It is identical to the Greek word for hostage. It has been hypothesized that his name was back extracted from the name of a society of poets called the Homeridae, which literally means sons of hostages, i.e. descendants of prisoners of war, as these men were not sent to war because the loyalty on the battlefield was suspect. They would not be killed in conflicts, so they were entrusted with remembering the area's stock of epic poetry, to remember past events from the time before literacy came to the area. In a similar vein, the word Homer may simply be a carryover from the Mediterranean seafarers' vocabulary adoption of the Semitic word base, Mr., which means say or tell. Homer may simply be the Mediterranean version of saga. It has also been suggested by pseudo-Plutarch that the name comes from a word meaning to follow and another meaning blind. Other sources connect Homer's name with Smyrna for several different etymological reasons. Homer's time frame, exactly when these poems would have taken on a fixed written form, is subject to debate. The traditional solution is the transcription hypothesis, wherein a non-literate singer dictates the poem to a literate scribe in the 6th century BC or earlier. The voice of antiquity is unanimous in declaring that Pisistratus, the tyrant of Athens, first committed the poems of Homer to writing and placed them in the order in which we now read them. More radical Homerists, such as Gregory Nagy, contend that a canonical text of the Homeric poems did not exist until established by Alexandrian editors in the Hellenistic period. The modern debate began with the prolegomena of Friedrich August Wolff. According to Wolff, the date of writing is among the first questions in the textual criticism of Homer. Having satisfied himself that writing was unknown to Homer, Wolff considers the real mode of transmission, which he purports to find in the rhapsodists, of whom the Homeridae were an hereditary school. Wolff reached the conclusion that the Iliad and Odyssey could not have been composed in the form in which we know them without the aid of writing. They must therefore have been, as Bentley has said, a sequel of songs and rhapsodies, loose songs not collected together in the form of an epic poem until about 500 years after their original composition. This conclusion Wolff supports by the character attributed to the cyclic poems, by one or two indications of imperfect connection, and by the doubts of ancient critics as to the authenticity of certain parts. This view is extended by the complicating factor of the period of time now referred to as the Greek Dark Ages. This period, which ranged from approximately 1250 to 750 BC, is estimated to have been immediately preceded by the historical counterpart to Homer's Trojan War. The composition of the Iliad, on the other hand, is placed immediately following the Greek Dark Age period. Further controversy surrounds the difference in composition dates between the Iliad and Odyssey. It seems that the latter was composed at a later date than the former because the work's differing characterizations of the Phoenicians align with differing Greek popular opinion of the Phoenicians between the 8th and 7th centuries BC, when the skills began to hurt Greek commerce, whereas Homer's description of Achilles' shield in the Iliad exhibits minutely detailed metalwork that characterized Phoenician crafts. They are characterized in the Odyssey as manifold scurvy tricksters. controversy over Homer's identity. Woolf's speculations were in harmony with the ideas and sentiment of the time, and his historical arguments, especially his long array of testimonies to the work of Pisistratus, were hardly challenged. The effect of Woolf's prolegomena was so overwhelming, and its determination so decisive, that, although a few protests were made at the time, the true Homeric controversy did not begin until after his death in 1824. The first considerable antagonist of the Woolfian school was Gregor Wilhelm Nietzsche, whose writings cover the years between 1828 and 1862, and deal with every side of the controversy. In the earlier part of his meaty temata, Nietzsche took up the question of written or unwritten literature, on which Woolf's entire argument turned, and showed that the art of writing must be anterior to Pisistratus. In the later part of the same series of discussions, and in his chief work, he investigated the structure of the Homeric poems, and the relation to the other epics of the Trojan cycle. These epics had in the meantime been made the subject of a work which, for exhaustive learning and delicacy of artistic perception, has few rivals in the history of philology, the epic cycle of Friedrich Gottlieb Welcker. The confusion which previous scholars had made between the ancient post-Homeric poets and the learned mythological writers was first cleared up by Welcker. Woolf had argued that, had the cyclic writers known the Iliad and Odyssey which we possess, they would have imitated the unity of structure which distinguishes these two poems. The aim of Welcker's labors was to show that the Homeric poems had influenced both the form and the substance of epic poetry. Thus arose a conservative school who admitted more or less freely the absorption of pre-existing lays in the formation of the Iliad and Odyssey, and also the existence of considerable interpolations, but assigned the main work of formation to prehistoric times and the genius of a great poet. Whether the two epics were by the same author remained an open question. The tendency of this group of scholars was towards separation. Regarding the use of writing, too, they were not unanimous. Karl Ottfried Müller, for instance, maintained the view of Woolf on this point, while strenuously combating the inference which Woolf drew from it. The prolegomena bore on the title page the words volumini, but no second volume ever appeared, nor was any attempt made by Woolf himself to compose it or carry his theory further. The first important steps in that direction were taken by Johann Gottfried Jacob Hermann, chiefly in two dissertations, De Interpolationibus Homeri, and Riteratus apud Homerum, called forth by the writings of Nietzsche. As the word interpolation implies, Hermann did not maintain the hypothesis of a conflation of independent lays, feeling the difficulty of supposing that all ancient minstrels sang of the wrath of Achilles at the return of Odysseus. He was led to assume that two poems of no great compass, dealing with these two themes, became so famous at an early period as to throw other parts of the Trojan story into the background, and were then enlarged by successive generations of rhapsodists. Some parts of the Iliad, moreover, seemed to him to be older than the poem on the wrath of Achilles, and thus, in addition to the Homeric and post-Homeric matter, he distinguished a pre-Homeric element. The conjectures of Hermann, in which the Woolfian theory found a modified and tentative application, were presently thrown into the shade by the newer trenchant method of Karl Lachmann, who sought to show that the Iliad was made up of 16 independent lays, with various enlargements and interpolations, all finally reduced to order by Pisistratus. The first book, for instance, consists of a lay on the anger of Achilles, and two continuations, the return of Chryseis and the scenes in Olympus. The second book forms a the second lay, but several passages, among them the speech of Odysseus, are interpolated. In the third book, the scenes in which Helen and Priam take part are pronounced to be interpolations, and so on. New methods try also to elucidate the question. Combining information technologies and statistics, the stylometry allows to scan various linguistic units, words, parts of speech, sounds, ... based on the frequencies of Greek letters. A first study of Dietmar Najark particularly shows the internal cohesion of the Iliad and the Odyssey, taking into account the repetition of the letters. A recent study of Stefan von Feld highlights the unity of the works of Homer compared to Hesiod. The thesis of modern analysts being questioned, the debate remains open.